I can tell you that when with Eliamep we decided to have this discussion on the 6th of November, we said to each other that maybe it's too soon, maybe we will not have a clear result, and how is this discussion go on? But as it seems, we have very, very soon an absolute result of the elections, and Donald Trump is going to become president again of the United States. And so now here, our discussion has more meaning because we are going to discuss how is that going to affect the United States, Europe, and the whole world, Ukraine, the Middle East war, a lot of things. So I want to welcome first Ian Lesser. Thank you, Ian, for being here. He's a distinguished fellow and advisor to the president in the German Marshall Fund. Our very own Lucas Tsoukalis, professor in Sciences Po University and president of Eliamep. And I don't know if we are ready to go to Washington and welcome Mike Manatos, a president at Manatos and Manatos and government relations and public policy firm. Thank you so much, Mr. Manatos, for this hectic day, finding the time to be here with us. And I want to begin with you. Donald Trump is going to become the president of the United States. How do you view these results? And was it something that you saw it coming and so quickly with so much force?
Well, first of all, thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity to be with you all this morning, our time. I haven't had much sleep, so if you'll forgive me if my brain is not clear, even though I've had some coffee and I've already exercised. This is the 23rd presidential election for my family in the 88 years that we've been in Washington working in the federal government or with the federal government. So you might be able to say we've seen it all, but truly this is unprecedented. Although the story today, I believe, is that last night this was being called the most unpredictable election of our times. And never there had been so much uncertainty heading into election, yet the results this morning are very clear. There was a big red wave, the biggest red wave since Ronald Reagan in 1984. The second President-elect Trump is the second Republican in 36 years to win the national vote. Yet going in, the polling showed that this was a toss-up. The polling showed that in the 7 swing states in the last 2 years, despite all the things President Trump said and did, despite President Biden coming out of as the nominee, that it was a toss-up in all 7 states for 2 years within the statistical margin of error. So that's really the story this morning, is that our country is a very different place than we thought it was last night. The voting showed that. So now it's a matter of reestablishing where we are, what the future holds. Not only will there be a Republican presidency, but a Republican Senate and likely a Republican House. And shockingly, to many, that every president for the last 30 years that has gone into office has done so with his party in control of the Senate and the House. And so it looks like that'll be the case again with President Trump.
So what is the reason for that so big victory, do you think? United States is now a divided nation. There were divisions in the United States and in the past, but what made American people vote so strongly for Donald Trump? Is it something that the Democrats cannot grasp, cannot understand? Because so many millions of Americans voted for that, and I'm sure they are not only people that love conspiracy theories or love fake news and all that. There are also normal American families, middle-class families, working-class families that decided that Donald Trump was a better choice for the United States.
Well, I think there'll be, in the hours, days, and months and years ahead, there'll be great analysis on exactly that question. But I think the initial thought of many is that it was the economy. And I think the polls showed that the #1 issue for Trump voters was the economy. The Democrats' message was basically that former President Trump was unfit to hold office. And I think the response by a large majority of Americans was that didn't matter. That what mattered to them was the economy, issues like immigration, and they felt that former President Trump would have a better plan to handle those major issues, and I guess a better track record as well, you could argue. But there's going to be a lot of thought as to where our country is. I think that also the Democrats were appealing to our better angels, whereas I think the Trump campaign was focused more on anger and fear, and returning to an America that they would argue when he was in charge, they would say things like there were zero wars and that we were more forceful presence internationally. And I think those arguments held more weight in the end with the majority of the American electorate.
Did in any of all these electoral race, democracy play a role in how democracy and the institution will seem under Donald Trump and under his Republican heir, his Trump heir, I would most probably say?
Not near the role that the Democrats thought, I believe. You heard President Biden talking about the soul of the nation and the future of democracy. When Vice President Harris came in, she had a similar message with a little bit of a different twist. But in the end, those issues did not seem to be on the tops of voters' minds. A majority of voters, I should say.
How do you think that this election will affect the European Union, the war in Ukraine, and the Middle East? A lot.
That's a very important question because certainly based on the last Trump administration, the 4 years, and based on the things that he has said on the campaign trail, the thought of it would be significantly different than policies of today. However, I think that is really one of the things President Trump that makes President Trump so unique is the difference between what he says at his rallies behind the lectern and what what policies are implemented. I mean, you saw in the first Trump administration under Secretary Pompeo with regard to U.S.-Greece and U.S.-Cyprus relations, there were some very significant, impactful steps taken forward that not only you saw bear fruit during the Trump administration, but after. So the hope is that I think from the perspective of Greece and Cyprus, that in the next Trump administration, you would have people who would have a similar focus and the ability to see the value of a strong U.S.-Greece, U.S.-Cyprus relation. Secretary Mike Pompeo, who I understand was having dinner with Prime Minister Mitsotakis just days ago, is on the short list for Secretary of Defense in this next administration. So really that, in my mind, and a lot of people in Washington, it's really those folks who will be Secretary of State and White House National Security Advisor who are going to be handling the hour-to-hour, day-to-day U.S. policy toward the Eastern Med.
And regarding Turkey and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in his last, when he was in the White House, he saw, I think, 7 or 8 times Trump met with Erdogan, but they had their problems.
You know, that in the end, throughout our decades of working with administrations on policy of the region, is what it comes down to, is the U.S. relationship with Greece and Cyprus is primarily seen through the prism of U.S.-Turkey relations. You go back to President Obama. In his first 2 years, the world leader that he spoke to more than any other was Erdogan. With President Trump, he certainly had as he would say, a very close relationship with Erdogan. And that is going to be, in our minds, really what defines this administration's policy towards Greece and Cyprus, is when Turkey starts to threaten Greece again, overfly Greece again, be more threatening to Cyprus, causing problems on the issue of the religious freedom of the ecumenical patriarch. How does the United States respond? How does President Trump respond? How does his Secretary of State respond? That really will be the true test.
And regarding the war in Ukraine, do you foresee an end to the war?
That's a question probably for Mr. Lesser and others who spend.
I will ask him that. I have already discussed that with him.
That's not my specialty, but certainly based on, again, things that former President Trump has said at his rallies and in interviews, suggests that he would have a very different outlook on the war with Ukraine. And
my last question, do you think that the Democratic Party, or is it too early to tell, must make a lot of changes inside the Democratic Party that must be done?
I think the Democrats across the board realized they got it wrong. And although I saw a beautiful series of clips just this morning that showed coming out of elections back for the last 20 years, the lesson learned, and you would say, these people say, this means that the Democrats must do this or the Republicans must do this. And it was the opposite of what was needed and what happened. So I think there'll be a lot of great analysis that we'll see how it pans out. But look, in the end, it was a huge red wave, one of the largest we've seen in decades. And that means something. And that means that a majority of Americans are looking for different priorities than the Democratic Party is defining the way they define it now. So there'll be a lot of soul searching. We'll see if the Democrats hold on to the House. Again, history would suggest history is not on their side to do so, nor really, frankly, the numbers. Although that's going to be something that will take certainly days, if not weeks, to determine because of the way votes are counted, particularly in states like California, where it looks like there'll be some very closely contested races. And even if they were to hold the House, I think you'd see similar to what the Republicans had in the House with the Democratic White House. With such a slim majority, you've got the ability of just a few members of Congress to really control a lot of the policy of the party. So even if the Dems were to hold on with a slim majority, that would be very difficult to really move forward on Democratic priorities in the Congress and with the White House, certainly.
And my last question, and then I'm going to let you rest, because I know that you haven't slept at all, and the day today is very hectic. Do you think that American people are going to find themselves again and stop being so divided? I mean, there was so much passion and so much hate between Democrats and Republicans.
And I'm glad you said that, because in my mind, that is the biggest challenge in the days and months ahead. Is in my family's decades and 80 plus years of working in Washington, never have we seen our country more divided and the rhetoric more toxic. No longer is it a debate on what do you believe is best for our country, and we see things very differently as Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives. But the person on the other side is seen as the enemy. And the way to get power back is to burn it all down. And that is just a very unfortunate way of conducting government. It's frankly not sustainable. So the hope is that this is the defining moment for both parties to find a way to reset, to readjust, and try to find a way to have more civil discussion on what we both sides passionately believe is best for our country, but do so in a way that moves the country forward and doesn't tear it down.
Thank you so much, Mr. Manatos. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Well, and now, Ian, I'm going to come directly to you about Ukraine, of course, how things are going to change in the war, with the war in Ukraine. Is Zelensky crying right now?
I think, green light. It's on. It's working. Absolutely. Thank you. Look, I mean, Ukraine, like everyone else, you've got to work with what you get, and we know the result now. I think the equation in Congress will make a big difference too, because that's integral to what can get funded or not funded in Washington. I think what this will do is probably push a great deal further and faster a debate that was already growing in Washington, but also in Europe, about what how does this end? How does this end? How does it stop in the sense of a ceasefire, and how does it end in terms of the ultimate sort of war aims for both sides, frankly, and what could be done? I think it's not. I think that the consensus in Washington will suddenly turn around and we will no longer support Ukrainian war aims. I mean, after all, in Washington, this is very much about Russia. It's about containing Russia. Whatever President Trump's views about Putin and Russia may be, I think the center of gravity still in both parties is to be rather hawkish on this, frankly. And so I don't see huge shifts except on the funding side. And on the funding side, I think it will be part of the burden sharing equation where, as on a whole set of other defense-related issues, Trump will be looking to Europe to spend more and to do more.
Lucas, do you want to comment on that? Because I know you have very strong opinions about the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian-Russian war.
Well, I don't know where to start from, but remember, I mean, there's one allow me to say a few general things before we move on to Ukraine. Many people have been talking recently about the emergence of a multipolar world that's coming at the end of an era of an undisputed US hegemony. And be that as it may, whether we are actually moving into a multipolar world or not, there is no doubt that the United States will remain the most powerful country on the planet for quite some time to come. And now, the ruler of that country from January 2025 is somebody who, first of all, will enjoy enormous power within the country, most likely through his control of the Republican Party, the Senate, most probably the House of Representatives, and he also has a favorable majority in the Supreme Court, yet a very divided country. And he's also the person whom we know from experience, and also judging from what he's been saying, that he doesn't believe in multilateral institutions. He doesn't believe in rules. He doesn't really believe in alliances. And he has a transactional approach to international affairs. You do deals bilaterally. And the other thing we know is that he doesn't really believe that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. Instead, he has a famous slogan, drill, baby, drill. Okay? So if you take all this together, Europeans are facing 4 very difficult years. Now, Ukraine, more specifically. I believe that we are much closer to a ceasefire in Ukraine than before, because Trump is unlikely to want to continue paying lots of money for long. He will put the pressure on Europeans. The Europeans are already paying more than the United States for Ukraine, but the military part, the United States is crucial. So if the Americans do not provide the armaments, Ukraine cannot continue, and in any case, Ukraine is losing ground, and has been steadily losing ground. If you want my guess is that with Trump, we will be closer to a ceasefire, if not an end, of the war in Ukraine than we would have been otherwise.
And Ian, in the Middle East, which also is a huge chapter, how is Donald Trump going to behave regarding Israel?
I think, a general observation about this is that, judging by the first experience with Donald Trump, is that he's actually rather cautious when it comes to American intervention, when it comes to the use of American military power, perhaps very aggressive, very assertive in economic diplomacy. That's a different thing. But when it comes to the use of force, I think he's actually rather cautious. Yes, he's hawkish on Iran. I think the prospects for getting back into a serious diplomacy with Iran over the nuclear development are dim. The Biden administration tried to revive it, but I think the prospects for that are not very good, obviously. I think he will be more inclined even to give Israel essentially free rein with what it's doing. It's not that we won't necessarily have advice about it, but these are not conditions where anyone's listening. And so, and I don't think he's going to press them harder. If anything, it'll be the reverse.
But he did.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but on the other hand, this very mercurial nature, he has a tendency to shake things up. And so who knows in that sense? I mean, he did some very different things. He recognized the Western Sahara with Morocco. He orchestrated, basically, at least on his watch, the Abraham Accords, which are still there. The Biden administration didn't dismantle any of these things. So there's always the potential for someone who comes in with even eccentric, different ideas, a different kind of energy, even inspiring a sense of dread in some places, to produce something different. I think that the more challenging side of this has to do with people who come into the administration, what their views are. The first time around, in 2016, it was a bit of a surprise that he won, and there wasn't a pipeline of people in these key foreign policy too, positions. This time there are people in line, and they have strong policy views, and that could make a difference.
And now, regarding, Lucas, the European Union, what is going to happen between the relationship of Donald Trump and the European Union? We know that he doesn't very much like Europe. We saw that also the first time, and also NATO. I'm not sure if he doesn't want NATO or if he wants the member states of NATO to pay more money. What is this? But European Union is going to suffer.
Well, I wrote provocatively about 2 years ago that if Mr. Putin does not succeed in being Europe's unifier, Mr. Trump may do this trick. But I'm not very confident, okay? We know that Donald Trump doesn't like the European Union. It considers it as some kind of an enemy organization. He said so on a number of occasions, and he behaved in that way when he was president. Now, I also know that in Brussels and elsewhere, people have been trying to prepare for such an eventuality in recent months. I think they started preparing rather too late. Some of us who were saying that this is an eventuality about a year and a half ago, we were not listened to. So now they are preparing, especially when it comes to trade. If Trump comes up with new tariffs, the Europeans have already prepared scenarios for retaliation. So think of the consequences. A trade war between the United States and the European Union is not going to be fun, okay? But on the other hand, people like not only Orban, but Meloni possibly, Le Pen and others will see the world differently because suddenly they have somebody on the other side of the Atlantic to whom they can relate. And I think that several people of the far right in Europe will start behaving differently from January. So this is going to be a serious divisive factor.
And that is going to affect, you think, also NATO?
NATO as well, but let's say Trump, the first thing he will do, he will put pressure on Europeans to increase their defense expenditure, which is fair enough because Europeans have been free riders on defense for a long time. Okay? They've been trying to catch up, but they've done so belatedly. But it's not only a question of defense burden, it is an approach. Apparently, the newly elected president and former president of the United States does not really believe in alliances. And that is more fundamental, okay? It's the bilateral transactional approach. So, you know, if you are beginning to have doubts about Article 5, you have to prepare yourself accordingly. I don't know where.
No, if I may, just on that one, I think, you know, some of the more disastrous scenarios that people have discussed about President Trump in NATO are probably not likely. I mean, he's not going to withdraw the United States from NATO, and I think both legally and politically this would not be very easy to do. It's not in our interest to do that, but he could make NATO very dysfunctional because everything is done by consensus. Even the Article 5 issue is not automatic, it's a political decision. And you know, so the American engagement in NATO and its credibility are intimately connected, and so it could be very rough in that sense. You know, every administration in recent years has brought this burden-sharing argument to NATO to spend more, to do more, and in fact, Europe is spending more and doing more, but it's nowhere near being able to replace the United States in European security terms, and that's a huge dilemma, and it's not something you could prepare for in a sense, just as the structural competitiveness challenge is not something you prepare for overnight, even though people have been contemplating this issue for some time. So part of the issue here, I think, both for NATO and for the EU, is that his victory underscores existing very real anxieties about these bigger structural issues, which are not going to be very easy to resolve.
And do you think that maybe he will withdraw United States from other institutions that he doesn't like?
Well, I mean, in his demonology, in his sort of pantheon of institutions he's not too keen on, I mean, you know, NATO is there, the EU is really there, the UN is at the core, in a sense. And UN agencies, you know, can be very vulnerable to this on the funding issue and on other fronts. I could imagine they would be very exposed. Well, exactly. I mean, there are a series of issues on which, during the Biden years, Europe and the United States managed to converge. And we're going to see divergence again on energy security, on green transition, on Iran nuclear. We can make a long list of these things. Democracy promotion would be another one. A big difference from the Biden administration.
And there he's going to find allies in the European Union.
Sure, of course he will.
In Orban, in Meloni, in Le Pen.
Absolutely.
So regarding China, is he going to need the European Union or European countries in handling China? Because he will be in a kind of trade war, if I'm not mistaken, and with China, which is his enemy.
I think, I mean, Lucas will have views about this too, but I mean, I think there are very few things Republicans and Democrats actually agree on in Washington now, and a tougher line on China is probably one of them, one of the very few ones. I think for Trump, it's all about the economic competition. He's less focused, I think, on the military strategic piece of it, but others in his party are. And, you know, obviously, even if he hadn't spoken about tariffs on European goods, which he has, if it was just about China, it would still have this effect on Europe for all kinds of reasons that probably Lucas is better to describe than I would. But I'll stop there. I mean, none of it very good news, I think. Maybe just one final point. I think it goes to something you asked about earlier. The tension between this economic nationalism that's rising, and he exemplifies this, but it's elsewhere too, on the one hand, and the need for more alliance cohesion on the other, because there's a war in Europe and a looming competition with China. These do not fit together. How do you make a case to allies about closer cooperation when you're engaged in a trade war with them? It doesn't work.
Lucas?
Now, I agree with Ian about the convergence in China. If there's one thing in Washington in the last few years that Democrats and Republicans agree is the way to be tough with China. Because they both consider China essentially as a challenge to US predominance, not only military but also economic and technological. Trump may put it less diplomatically. I was looking for a good word to express this. But the substance is not going to be very different. But Trump will exert, and both US administrations have exerted pressure on Europeans to toe the line on China. So when the US takes measures, tariffs, whatever, export controls, etc., against China, there is pressure on European capitals to follow suit. I guess that with Trump presidency, the pressure can become more intense.
Unbearable.
Unbearable. And that is going to be another issue of contention, because remember, there is an objective difference between the United States and Europe vis-à-vis China. European economies are much more open economies than the American economy. If you take the EU as a whole, trade dependence as percentage of GDP is about double that of the United States, which means that the Europeans cannot afford a kind of a protectionist war with China or with anybody else. The Americans can afford it more easily. It's going to be disastrous for all of us, but the Americans can bear the burden much more easily than Europeans. And there it's going to be a very awkward choice that Europeans will have to make. Okay, so if the American administration comes and tells you, we protect you, but the price for protection includes also towing the line on China, and you say, but this is my vital economic interest, well, try to have an interesting conversation with a guy who's going to be the head of the State Department.
will you have a different approach towards United Kingdom? Will United Kingdom play a role? And that's a question for both of you. Ian? UK is a nuclear power.
I mean, the truth is that despite some of the expectations in the UK since Brexit, there has been no reinforcement of the special relationship with the United States. It's still very substantial in all sorts of ways, especially in the financial sector, and many other things, on defense too. I think in some ways, actually, Trump may be better disposed to the UK than Biden was. Biden had a thing, especially on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and things like this. He had issues where he, on the other hand, there's a government in power at the moment in the UK that is obviously not going to find this congenial. But I don't see much. I honestly don't see a lot of movement or change in that, or anything else. I don't think it figures centrally in thinking in Washington, and Europe. I think in some ways got bored with it a long time ago. But I don't know what you think.
Perhaps just one thing to add. I was watching the news this morning, and one of the people who were present in the main room celebrating with Mr. Trump was Mr. Farage. So Mr. Farage is the best link that the Trump administration has in the UK, in the same way that Mr. Orban is the best link that the US administration has in Europe. So if you put those two things together, you can visualize scenarios about the next few years.
The question that I put to Mr. Manatos, to Mike Manatos also, was why is this happening? Is it something that left liberal parties? No one wants to answer that question. I mean, why is this happening? And because it's happening in the European Union. It's not an American thing.
I think Mr. Manatos, in terms of the American situation, got it exactly right, as near as we can read it. And I think there are some echoes of this in Europe as well. That the United States not only a highly polarized society at the moment, but also, deeply troubled in other ways. Tremendous economic anxiety at different levels of the society. I would say, not just at those who are less well off. I mean, and this felt experience of the economy. I mean, it's very funny because if you sit in Brussels and they look at the United States and you see all of these indicators and it all looks good.
Good, very good.
And the comparison is often drawn with Europe and so on, GDP growth, on inflation, on employment rates and so on. But as the felt economy for individuals, it's clearly not good. And Mr. Manatos talked about this. I think it was about the economy, as it often is. I mean, there's nothing distinctive in that. But I think one of the lessons here, and it has echoes in Europe, is that the election underscores this accumulated grievance, the anger in the society about the distribution of wealth and about all sorts of other things. And it has its equivalents in Europe as well. It's also the other thing I would say about this is that it's not just about kind of a revolt against the elites. It is that, but it's not just that. It's also in many respects a kind of civil war among the elites.
What do you mean by that?
The amount of resources, the amount of money, the amount of energy that goes into these campaigns in the United States. You need a lot of very well-placed people with real resources to be backing you as well. And so, part of this debate is also, going on among the elites, among privileged sectors of the society who don't have the same vision of what the country ought to look like. We can talk about some of these sort of titans of technology and other people who've been involved in this, but it's not just that. I mean, there's a lot of donors, there's a lot of activists. It's, I think, a mistake just to think about it as a populist revolt against elites. It's more than that.
Lucas?
Allow me to be a bit more blunt. I think that Western democracies are going through a crisis of democracy, and a very serious one. And one of the worst crises of democracy is in the United States. Because, I mean, this is a country that is more unequal than it has been for decades, more polarized than it has been for decades, We're in a country where also increasingly money literally buys power. Okay? And this is serious. I mean, if I were not diplomatic, I would call it increasingly a plutocracy. But because I'm diplomatic, I'm not using the term. All right? But it is serious. The problem is really serious. But the strange thing is that you have large numbers of people who feel left behind, who are cut off the system, who look to a billionaire who offers lower taxes to save them.
Lower taxes to the rich also.
Yeah, precisely. Lower taxes to the rich, lower regulation, and a smaller state. And the combination is very interesting. And of course, if I were a member of the Democratic Party, I would have to sit down and think very seriously what I got wrong, because they must have got something wrong, all right, judging from results.
But can you say that isn't that the same in Germany? We see the Greens and the Socialists, we see what is going on with Macron and Le Pen. I mean,
there is a problem, and there is a crisis of democracy in most European countries. And you see that the number of people who don't vote has been steadily increasing. The number of people who have party affiliation has almost disappeared. I mean, there are no parties. Parties are disappearing. France has no parties. It has mouvement, rassemblement, or whatever, but that's not parties, the way we knew them. So it's a radical transformation of the political scene. But at least Germany is not as unequal as the US is. And that is a serious difference, because it still has an effective welfare state, which the US doesn't have.
Ian, do you fear that now Trump can play with check and balances in the United States and with the institutions there?
Well, look, we don't know the outcome in the House quite yet, although we think we know what's going to happen. And in the Senate race, we know. I mean, if you know, and Mr. Manatos talked about all of this. I mean, if all three are in Republican hands, plus the situation in the Supreme Court, I mean, this is not the sort of balance of powers as we would have thought of it traditionally. And especially in this highly polarized environment, and it goes back to what you were just discussing, which is that the parties don't operate in the same way anymore. I mean, they used to, the breakdown of traditional parties, just as you've seen it in Europe, is taken a different form in the United States in our two-party system, but where the parties are, and there was a columnist who wrote very effectively about this recently, are less traditional parties, and they're competing cults, basically, belief systems. Not necessarily cult of personality on the Democratic side, but you know, if it were just a matter of demographics and how many registered Democrats versus Republicans came out, Democrats would win every time. There are more registered Democrats than Republicans. The demography it was assumed that it was progressively going in the Democratic direction because of immigration and other things, but this election outcome disrupts that discussion in many, you know, profound ways, it seems to me. Do I think, is democracy profoundly under threat? It's under threat, no question about it, for all the reasons you just discussed. But I think, you know, I still have some faith, let me put it that way, in the resilience of the system. And there is a kind of self-correcting quality to these things. You know, we'll have 4 years. He cannot run again. If he could pull us out of all of these...
He has understood that, you think.
Well, I hope so. If he can pull us out of all of these... We're making some assumptions, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. That if he can pull us out of all of these structural dilemmas that we've been talking about, well, good for him, and perhaps the Republicans will win again. But I'm not willing to bet on that. And that anger may get directed in other directions, you know, 4 years from now. We'd have to see.
Lucas, do you have to comment on that?
Not really. I mean, sure, hope dies last. And we should preserve some hope. The omens are not very good, to put it bluntly, because judging from experience, judging also from what has been said, in the electoral campaign, and judging also from the preparations for the transfer of power. But they say the saving grace can be that Donald Trump has shown very often he's a pragmatist. So he can say one thing in the campaign, he can do something different. But still, there is a limit to hope. And people, I mean, especially seeing it from a European point of view, Europeans need to prepare for a more difficult world. And it's not going to be easy. I've been trying always to be somehow a kind of optimist of the will, but the situation is difficult in Europe. I mean, the challenges are far ahead of our collective capabilities at the present moment.
And now I have a question about Greek-Turkish relations. We are talking with Turkey, Greece, Athens is talking with Ankara, and we are having a very good moment, to say that, a little honeymoon in our relations, which we hope that will continue, and maybe eventually we will have some solutions. Do you think, and in the Cyprus problem, the same, I believe, the United States will play now under Donald Trump a role, a positive role, no role?
Well, we'll play a role. I mean, much of this, on some issues like this, it seems to me there is an accumulated history of practice and a kind of professionalism. I mean, there are certain aspects of American policy that are dominated by political appointees, and sometimes they come in with radically different views, and that could happen. But on this issue, on certain regional issues like this, I could imagine a degree of continuity. There is no question that the United States is kind of fully vested in a Greek Turkish détente. It does no good for us to have the tension that we have had periodically at very high levels. And I think any American administration is going to want to see that calmer, even if the views about Turkey in particular blow in different directions. Yes, important strategic ally, this and that, but it's not like the European relationship with Turkey. At some level, the American relationship with Turkey is optional, and vice versa. And it's never been easy. It's been very difficult to manage through multiple administrations on both sides. It's just a very tough one for all kinds of reasons we could discuss. Maybe we're more similar than we like to admit, sovereignty conscious, nationalistic, goes on, security conscious, but it doesn't make it easy. And at the moment, none of the key bilateral issues, other than the issues that had to do with NATO, have really been resolved with Turkey. They're still there on S-400s and Cyprus and other things. So I think any administration is going to react in similar ways to that. So I don't expect big differences, to be honest. I certainly don't see anything negative coming for Greece, other than to say that Greece is a stakeholder in what goes on between the United States and the EU, or with NATO. I mean, you're vested in those institutions, and so that affects your interests. But bilaterally, I wouldn't expect anything disruptive.
Lucas?
Yeah, I don't disagree. Going back to Greek-Turkish, you talked about a honeymoon. It's a renewed honeymoon in a marriage forced by geography, as long as we don't talk substance, all right? Because this is what has been the precondition of the latest honeymoon.
Yeah, Greece is allergic to that, I think, yes, more than Turkey, I dare say.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't disagree. So now that we have to start talking substance, it's getting more delicate. Otherwise, as far as the role of the United States is concerned, I don't expect any dramatic change within your administration, again, to the extent that we can predict, because remember, one of the key elements of Mr. Trump is unpredictability, all right? The same applies to Erdogan, by the way. So when you are dealing with an unpredictable partner, you have to be more careful. And the key question is, if there is something goes out of control between Greece and Turkey, Will there always be somebody keen in Washington, D.C. to pick up the phone and do something? That's a key question.
Yeah. If Pompeo is defense minister, maybe that would be the answer to your questions, but it remains to be seen. Well, at this point, I don't know if you have any questions. Yes, yes, please.
I do. In fact, I have two questions.
Okay.
Does the panel feel that the multi-million contributions of Elon Musk, of the widow of the worldwide gambling empire, and others, have taken the vote and democracy too off the table for the individual American? That's question one. Question two is a here and now question. The U.S. has said that the North Koreans fighting in Ukraine are fair targets. Is that now off the table?
Ian.
On the second question up first, I mean, I don't think that's off the table. First of all, you know, we have an administration in place for the next months, and that's not going to change. And this could well play itself out over the next month. So, you know, it's still, you know, Biden's watch on this. So, and in fact, you know, unfettered by political constraints, you could see, in fact, some more deliberate things, in fact, over the next months. So no, so I'm not sure that would change very much under a Trump administration. I can't imagine him being less sort of hawkish on this, having tried once an initiative with North Korea, which didn't really work out, which left some bad taste, I think, probably for Trump. I don't imagine that would change. The first question you ask is a little more interesting. I mean, I think, you know, the truth is that the amounts of money that are necessary after, you know, we had campaign finance reform and it went away. And it's just shocking. I mean, over the last 3-4 months, Kamala Harris raised $1 billion. And maybe it wasn't enough. And so the amounts of money, not only in the presidential races, but in the races in the Senate and the House, are stunning, and it's distorting in ways that people, I think, do worry about a great deal. Yes, on the Democratic side, it was slightly different. You didn't have necessarily an Elon Musk, a bunch of celebrities, very wealthy. You know, there is a huge fundraising machine on both sides, and I think it distorts our politics in all sorts of ways that we're very familiar with. I don't think it's very healthy. I don't think it's likely to change.
But Trump
He took it.
particularly come with conditions and are, one could say,
Yeah.
corrupt to put Elon Musk in
Well, and to run a near lottery and to, yeah, well, I mean, I take the point. I mean, it's very disturbing, but I think it also goes back to the issue we were discussing earlier. There is a civil war among the elites going on in the United States, in addition to all of these other things. You know, very well-resourced people who are able to weigh into the politics, you know, in the electoral side of it, but also in terms of lobbying on legislation and many other things. It has an absolutely distorting effect on our policy. And I think that's deeply unhealthy, to be honest. And why people are not revolting against that more directly is, I find, unfathomable, but, well, there it is.
I think that one of the most damaging for democracy decisions ever taken by the Supreme Court was a decision to lift the restrictions on the use of money for electoral campaigns, because that turns democracy into democracy that's something you can buy, all right? And that's very serious. And we've seen that in the latest election. Now, with Mr. Elon Musk, I mean, again, watching bits of the victory speech of Mr. Trump, he had a long reference to Elon Musk. So this is a guy who is the richest man on the planet, who talks about lower taxes, lower regulation, and smaller state, having himself benefited enormously from government-subsidized research, from government-paid contacts for his own business. Interesting combination. So we are waiting to see what kind of role is he going to have. I presume he doesn't want to have an official ministerial position because that doesn't work well with his private interests. But he can have influence and he can have some kind of other role, which is serious.
And also some say, I talked to some colleagues of mine from the Wall Street Journal, and they insinuated that there was some talk about him trying for president in the next elections.
Well, with $260 billion fortune, you can buy anything.
Yeah, we saw that with Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. Takis Ioakimidis, yes, please. Is there a microphone, please?
Okay.
Okay.
Lucas, talking about the crisis of European democracy, what do you think would be the Trump effect on European democracy? I would argue that it would embolden somehow the populist and the European authoritarian forces, the Le Pens, the Orbans, the Farages, and they would try to somehow capture the political sphere and the European Union, in fact. And that might be the most damaging effect of Orban's victory for Europe. That's question number one. Question number two, which, as a matter of fact, I have picked it up from a...
Sorry, Takis, I think we need one more microphone. And okay.
The second question, I picked it up from a well-known historian on the BBC, Simon Sharma, who said that how serious is a country that re-elects a convicted criminal as its president for the next 5 years? How serious is it?
Lucas, I'm tempted to say it's all too serious. It's all too serious. I mean, you know, there's a sentencing coming up actually for him shortly, and how this will. People aren't even discussing this yet, but because it's not dominating the news today, but it will be. And how will he function under those conditions? By the way, it's not unprecedented in other countries to have this kind of thing, but. You know, it's shocking to me that actually, my sense anyway, the convictions themselves, after time, didn't seem to play very much in the electoral rhetoric. And I'm not even sure, just to go back to the point about the money, it's disturbing on many levels, but if you were just as a thought experiment to take all of that money out of the equation, would the result have been different? Probably not, for the very underlying reasons that Mr. Manatos was talking about, and we've been discussing as well. I mean, many of the anger in society, the polarization would be there anyway. And who was well positioned to play to that? Apparently, you know, Vice President Harris was not.
As far as the threat to European democracy is concerned, I've already mentioned it. I mean, all the far-right leaders will be having a party today in Europe, I mean, because it changes the balance inside Europe. And they have a point of reference, and a very powerful point of reference. So Farage, Orban, others. You know, I'm afraid that Meloni would be different in the next few months from the Meloni we've seen, because there are new prospects. So it's serious. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, please.
Now, everybody knows that Donald Trump denies climate change, and its slogan is famous "drill, baby, drill." So Now, and everybody also knows that it is more than probable, and it's actually quite certain, that he will once again withdraw the US from the 2015 UN Paris Agreement. Okay, now, the question is, what will such a move have as an impact on the EU, and more specifically on the European Union green transition and, green agenda more generally, energy transition policies? Will it embolden Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission, and the EU institutions to pursue more aggressively in that direction? Because the European Union will actually be the only Western power to have such a green agenda after, the fall of the American empire, I might say, in that sense that they will be climate denialists, or on the contrary, will the political groups that are represented in the European Parliament, that are the right and far right wings, will be emboldened in exerting more pressure to Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission, and the EU institutions to draw back or to reverse course, on this green agenda? Which one will it be, or none of the two? Thank you.
First of all, judging from the experience of the first Trump administration, one good thing about the US being a federation is that you may take decisions in Washington, D.C., but several states, including California and others, may continue regardless. And this is precisely what happened with climate change measures. Yeah. But, of course, the United States is the biggest transmitter of CO2 emissions. And if the US no longer believes in green transition, one interesting question would be, what will the Trump administration do with the Inflation Reduction Act? All right, that is spending billions subsidizing new industries that promote green transition. Will he stop it? Will he continue it? I have no idea. Nobody knows. Probably he doesn't. But whatever the US does is going to be crucial because it's the biggest transmitter. All right? And that also means that any possibility of cooperation, because anything to happen for green transition, you need at the very minimum the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Americans to agree. They need to have a deal. So the possibility of such a deal becomes much smaller. Now, will the Europeans persevere? I don't know, honestly. I mean, it's true that appetite for the green transition has somehow been reduced in recent years as the cost of transition becomes more obvious. Will the Europeans react? It will very much depend on how Europe in general decides to react to the second Trump administration. It's not going to be an easy decision.
Yes, here in front. No.
Very much for this. I was wondering, why do you think that the polls failed so miserably again? Is it a question of people of the shy Trump voter, people not saying that they would vote for Trump, or have we reached that level of polarization in the U.S. that different groups of people just do not meet anymore, so that conclusions can arise from
Ian?
Thank you.
It's a very interesting question, and it's sort of the latest example of a number of these polls that have simply gotten it wrong. I mean, Brexit was the first and most famous of these, but there have been others. And it's partly, I think, that it undercounts the right-wing vote in many places because people don't want to admit to pollsters that they see the world one way or another. I think also, and something almost more troubling about it, I think in this case, is that how many people were going to be prepared to admit that they weren't ready to vote for a woman and they weren't ready to vote for a woman of color, including women. And that's a little bit of a darker story about society, actually. I mean, and I think part of that is what was at play here. Also, there's a question just about the base of both candidates being energized. Who came out to vote on the day? that matters. But I'm sure it's going to be, that we'll be looking at this again, and it will have implications in Europe where this polling is also quite critical.
Well, just a small point. I remember when Mr. Berlusconi was in power in Italy, you ask people, who do you vote for? Many people never admitted to pollsters that they would vote for Berlusconi. So always the results for Berlusconi in elections were better than what polls predicted. So there is a similar element, I think, both with Trump and with women, that they may not want to vote for a woman, but still do not want to confess that in public.
Plamen Tonsev, can we have the microphone here, please? It's in front.
Well, thanks very much for a fascinating discussion. It's a bit downbeat, but still fascinating. A couple of questions to Mr. Tsoukalis. One of the paradoxes of the elections and what happened yesterday is that one of the key grievances of US voters relates to the economy and the high cost of living. At the same time, the United States economy is actually very robust. So isn't that a bit contradictory? I wonder whether that could be explained through the Phillips curve, since you're an economist. The lower the unemployment rate, the higher the inflation rate, and vice versa. So could it be that, ironically, actually, the Biden administration fell victim to its own success in the economy? The second question to Mr. Lesser, you made a very interesting point about the United States possibly withholding funding from the United Nations, and some UN agencies being very vulnerable to that. That's a likelihood indeed. The thing is that with this sort of isolationism that the second Trump administration is likely to display, won't this open further space for China to step into the void? And while Trump's policy may be aimed at containing China in economic terms, its economic heft, at the same time, this could help China increase its geopolitical, sway over the global south and beyond. Thanks very much.
Lucas, you want to start?
Yeah, I suppose Europe would have been delighted if it had the economic performance of the US in the last 2 or 3 years. So Biden has made a revolution in economic policy. I think since probably Johnson, we haven't seen such a radical change in US economic policy, and it has to a large extent delivered the goods, with the exception of inflation. So this seems to be the main point that people are complaining about. All right, and this has probably cost Harris, among other things. What else to say?
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's, the measures that you hear when you discuss these issues of competitiveness in Brussels and so on, and the conventional measures, I don't think that was what was motivating people. I mean, someone put it to me the other day that economists think about inflation, people think about prices. And I've had my own, anecdotally, just my own experience. I mean, there's nothing objective about this, but I took some colleagues to get some sandwiches in Washington a few months ago, and to go out, take them away, 3 sandwiches, 3 bottles of mineral water, small ones. It was $85, and then they wanted a tip on top, and the prices were shocking, really, and so clearly people were very resentful about this. But I do think there is a kind of accumulated recognition of this distributional problem in the United States that has come back to bite us in a sense, politically. It's happened before. I mean, and people have tried to address it, more or less successfully, famously with Roosevelt, but that was under the condition of depression and other things. I think that's part of what we see. And then there's the more recessed thing, and it gets to the polling question as well, this identity politics business. It's linked to, but not exactly the same as the migration border control issue. This anxiety in society, which Trump was able to stir up very effectively. it's about economics, but it's also even more fundamentally about identity and about perceptions about criminality and all sorts of things like this. This sort of deep identity politics, which is very, edgy stuff. And I think a lot of that was at play. And forgive me, the second question was
about China.
China. Well, I don't think what we are likely to see is isolationism. I think it's unilateralism. And I think a kind of slightly sort of parsimonious use of American power, but what use there is will be focused quite tightly for I think many in his circle take this even further, on the question of containing China. And so I think the issue about giving away the store by letting them have free reign in UN agencies, or not putting up alternatives to BRICS, or all of these other kinds of development banks, and I don't think that's how they see it. I think they will see the instruments of tariffs and technology, export controls, and things of this nature as being the principal instrument. I think if their view would be roughly that if China wants to put its effort into UN agencies, let them do it. That would be my sense.
Mr. Kamaras, he needs a microphone.
We had a discussion with Mr. earlier, but I think what is listening as well. The issue I wanted to put to both of you is, assuming that Trump indeed adopts an aggressive tariff policy, right? What it's going to, and I think it's a significant if, personally I don't take it for granted, but if it does happen, what's going to do to the far right in France and Germany? I mean, you cannot have a capitalism in one country, in either one of these highly export-oriented economies, and we tried Hitler before and it didn't quite work out, right? So if Trump declares war on French and German manufactured exports, what's going to do that to the National Front and Alternative for Germany? Thank you.
That's a very good question.
That's not an easy question to answer. I'm almost sure that if Trump actually proceeds with new tariffs, there will be retaliation from Brussels. They've been preparing for that. And because for trade you need qualified majority and not unanimity, it will happen. Now, how will the right wing perceive this in France? Perhaps they will toe the European line, because remember that one of the things that have changed in Europe is that far-right parties are no longer calling for exit, but they are calling for voice. So they're saying, we don't want to exit the European Union, we are going to turn the European Union into hell for the rest of you, okay? But by staying, which is more clever. So I think that a protectionist war, having the Front National or Rassemblement, whatever it is now, saying that we go it alone, France, I think it's unlikely. So in that respect, EU unity will remain very likely. But I mean, these are scenarios, right?
As you said in the beginning, Lucas, you said that maybe Trump will unite Europe at the end of the day.
That's my hope. That's my hope.
Do you want to, Ian, to comment? No. Yes. One question here. Can we have the microphone in the front, in the second row?
Thank you. Thank you for your time and comments. I have two short questions. The first one going back to the US. You both touched upon a bit on the transition period, and you mentioned that the US, indeed, they have a president for the next 3-4 months. But I was wondering, at the same time, they also have a president-elect that, given his track records and comments for a golden age, I'm wondering how this will affect the voice of the US to the world when you have a president, you have a statement from President Biden accompanied by a statement probably in the opposite direction from a president-elect. And the second question, I'm an MMF alumni of GMF, and I remember spending last year my trip in the US talking about the elections, and I want to focus a bit and want your comments on the role Vice President Harris played before she was nominated, how we spent 4 years having a vice president a bit on the sidelines compared to the momentum she took in the last few months when it was decided that President Biden would step down, and compared or kind of link it to what would be the role of Trump's vice president in the next 4 years, in the sense that age still remains an issue for the president-elect, and we might in 2 or 3 years, encounter another similar condition. So, do we expect in the Trump administration to have a more active vice president, or Vice President Vance will also be somebody that will start in the sidelines and maybe in the end blossom?
Ian?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to hear that you're an MMF, and I hope you enjoyed the experience. By the way, you'll allow me some shameless advertising. You may or may not be aware that both the current Greek foreign minister and his opposite number in Turkey were both Marshall Memorial Fellows. No, we don't take credit for the détente, but who knows, maybe it didn't hurt. For many years we've done polling, but others, Pew and others have done it as well, that shows an extraordinarily close correlation between international views of the US president as an individual and views about the United States. There is almost an unshakable correlation. Even policy shifts from administration to administration don't seem to shift it very much. So in one case, Bush was widely disliked in Europe, Iraq, etc. He was much more congenial to Europe in the second administration. It made no difference. Europeans especially decided they didn't like him, still didn't like him. It affected views of the United States, and also a kind of view of the United States, if I can say, as a brand, which also is a question for the private sector and for other civil society organizations even, get affected by this. Obama, it was the opposite experience. Europeans admired Obama tremendously. He didn't do many of the things Europeans would have wanted him to do, but they still admired him tremendously, and he carried along, positive views of the United States as a result. Well, it will be interesting to see. Now, I saw some polling the other day about in Europe, if you could vote in the U.S. election, how would you vote? It wasn't as extreme as I had imagined. Yes, there were countries in the north, in particular, Nordics and some others, where it was very stark. But there were many places where, marginally anyway, Trump had an advantage. And a lot of them were sort of 60-40, 30-70, numbers like this. I think there are serious implications kind of for the American image and brand that are pulled along by this perception of the administration, and in particular by the president. And I can imagine this being extremely stark in his case because he is such a personality, let's say. We'll see about that. I think on the role of the vice president, well, I have to say, I don't know how many people might have read J.D. Vance's book that he published, Hillbilly Elegy, which he published about a decade ago or so. It's actually an extremely interesting book. It talks about his own background and so on. My own impression is that he's a rather savvy individual and quite sharp on a lot of the policy questions. I mean, politically astute, let's say, to be diplomatic. And I think, looking towards exactly the circumstance that you spoke about, a fairly elderly president, certainly a president that can't run again, he's going to have his eye on that, in terms of his own political ambition. And I think that will shape the way he approaches the role in many ways. So more activist than Harry? Well, perhaps slightly more. And I'm sure he will do his best to avoid, poisonous portfolios like the border.
The only thing I found interesting in the bit I listened to in the victory speech, Trump started by saying, I had doubts about this guy, but then I changed my mind and I was proven right. So he can say anything about anybody, right? Including his vice president. He had doubts about it. Yeah.
I can see one hand for many minutes now behind, in the last row there. Yeah, one.
Thank you very much for your remarks and this riveting conversation. Konstantinos Zekiellis Kanellopoulos, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Elia MEP's European program. My question has to do, I want to dig a little deeper with regards to the election's impact on European integration. And the election is signaling a shift back to neo-Jacksonianism, a shift back to splendid isolationism. You could make that analogy. How you mentioned, Mr. Tsoukalis, the Kissinger question: who do I call if I want to call Europe? And given Trump's dismissive stance towards Europe, he may not even call. But how do you see that as a critical juncture for the necessity for strategic autonomy in the European Union in the areas of defense and foreign policy? And then secondly, how do you see this election affecting the future of the liberal international order, which is something Dr. Lesser and myself worked together under the umbrella of the German Marshall Fund and the Transatlantic Academy. Is this perhaps a critical juncture for the post-1945 liberal international order? Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, a short answer to the liberal economic order question would be it's kaput. Okay? If you want me to elaborate further, I can, but essentially, you have a rising protectionism and growing unilateralism for years now. So normally we would expect this to become even worse in the years to come, especially from the United States. So the liberal economic order, the way you knew it and the way we knew it, is going through a radical transformation. How far it goes, nobody knows. I hope it's not completely destroyed. Now, as far as Europe is concerned, one can only develop different scenarios. It's very difficult. On the one hand, you will have, I mean, the Trump administration increases the pressure and the forces that militate in favor of more unity and more strategic autonomy. Because more Europeans come to realize that if they don't hang together, they will hang separately. Right? And that applies also to the Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans, whenever they heard the word strategic autonomy, they started shivering because they thought that strategic autonomy was meant to be cut off from the United States. Now, if they have an American president who, for example, doubts Article 5, and says that, you know, I will tell the Russians to do whatever they like if they don't pay up. No, you know, you have a pressure to get together with the other Europeans and increase your collective capacity. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that Europe is in trouble. Many European countries are in crisis, very weak governments. The government in Paris is in trouble. The government in Berlin is in trouble. Who the hell is going to take the lead? Estonia? So, you know, I could give you both sides of the coin. I don't know which one will prevail. The most likely reaction of Europeans would be to muddle through, but you can't muddle through in such a world. So.
Ian?
Well, just to say, I mean, the liberal international order, I mean, you will probably never hear an American politician utter those words again for the next years. It's become absolutely toxic. It embodies, in a single phrase, all the things that got Trump elected. For those who think about at least the international piece of it, it's just got all the wrong words in it, all three of them. And you put them together and it's even worse. And so, you know, and of course the foreign policy elite itself was already debating what could this possibly still mean and all the rest of it. But at the sort of informed public level, it's quite toxic, I would say. Strategic autonomy. I mean, this is another one of these things. Strategic autonomy as an aspiration. I mean, this is something fully in the American interest. And I would say the American sort of strategic establishment long ago came to the conclusion that if this was the way to get Europe to spend more and do more, all to the good. The problem, of course, is that it can't just be philosophical anymore. There's a war in Europe, there's an America that's distracted and maybe even disengaging. You have to do stuff. And that implies spending a great deal, but also doing all sorts of things that will be the work of years to try to do, even if there's a consensus to do it, to build that kind of capacity for strategic autonomy, the way Macron has talked about it or others, is an enormous project. And it's unclear to me whether the will to do that actually exists. And not just about spending the money, it's about other things. It's about attitudes towards the use of force, it's all sorts of things. And of course, if you have this mood of economic nationalism, it makes it even more difficult.
Is it on? Yes. I see many hands in 10 minutes. We have to stop our discussion, but there behind, I can see you there. Yeah.
In 2016, Trump lost the popular vote. Music. So he lost the popular vote, and a lot of pundits quickly said that the system is broken, the electoral college needs to go, and it was an error in the architecture of a democracy. But now he's won the popular vote, and a lot of the people who followed that logic might be compelled to say that the electorate is broken. But I think that's quite a dangerous argument to make. So I was wondering how you two would navigate the transition from the system is broken because he never won the popular vote to, oh, now he has won the popular vote by 5 million. So it's not really the system that's always at fault.
Lucas, Ian, who goes first? Ian. Okay.
If I were to paraphrase Bertolt Brecht, I think he said at some point, if you don't like decisions of the people, we have to change the people. So, which is, of course, not doable or desirable. So, yes.
Well, I mean, you know, more prosaically, I think there isn't going to be reform of the electoral college system. I mean, it was hard to do before, even when people didn't have much faith in it. Now, there will be I don't think there'll be any pressure to do that. There's every reason not to. I mean, there are reasons to do it objectively, but politically, I think it's a non-starter. I think it is sort of what it is, and that's where we are.
Another question. Here's the lady here, please. Yeah, you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Ian. I have a very quick and not very sophisticated question compared to the other ones. Considering that a large percentage of the American public has a problem voting for and electing a woman, especially a woman of color, and it's shocking that both of Trump's victories have been over women, right? Do you think that the older, enfeebled, weakened, declining, but white male candidate would have had a better chance? Do you think that if Joe Biden had not stepped down, despite his obvious decline, I hate to admit that, and leaving just 3 months practically for Kamala to get ready, do you think that he might have actually beaten Trump? Because we know it's not all about the economy. You were very clear as well. Very much a problem with the women in politics. And I'm very curious because it's absolutely a devastating result. What do you think? Thank you very much.
It's very good to see you. No, it's an excellent question. My sense is that Biden would have lost as well. Maybe even more heavily. I don't know. For different reasons, perhaps. But it's a good question. I think, you know, and the Clinton experience is also enlightening because, you know, in some sense, both of those candidates, Biden was a slightly separate issue with his age, but both Clinton and Harris were, in a sense, exactly the wrong people to run against Trump. Unfortunately. I'm not sure, and there might have been ways to produce that person, because there are younger individuals in the Democratic Party. I mean, there are people who are extremely impressive, Pete Buttigieg and people like this, but he has other things. Is the society ready for that? Well, I'm not so sure. No, I think, we have to acknowledge the fact that there was something rather compelling about the combination of Trump's personality, the angry mood in the country, his ability to mobilize previously unmobilized voters, that made a difference. It's skillful, or talent, or whatever you want to say. And I think if we put that aside and say it was just a kind of freak event and it shouldn't have gone that way, and we're not being objective.
Perhaps as a non-American, one thing to add is watching how the Democratic Party reacted, first of all, too late vis-à-vis Biden. And then the way it went through the process of selecting a candidate, denying reality for a long time, says quite a lot about the Democratic Party becoming dysfunctional. We're having a problem with its very instinct of survival. So, when people win, it's not only those who win, but you have to say something about those who lose. A lot has to be said about the way the Democrats have lost decisively everywhere. Okay.
I don't know if there is someone in the last rows there. Okay.
Hello. You mentioned something about the two parties being political cults, in a sense, that the conditions of the economy matter less. What actually happens, material conditions, don't matter as much, really, as the narrative being played. And maybe the Democrats have focused erroneously on unity and bringing the country together when the game has changed, that it is now us or them, and Trump was better able to capture the anger and division and thus win the election. So do you think that the Democrats will change and be more adversarial rather than, say, inviting Republicans to a future cabinet? And my second question would be, how do you prevent institutional capture in the United States when so much that prevents it is based on formality and not really any strict rules that prevent, a collapse of democratic institutions in the country?
Ian?
Thank you. I mean, they're excellent questions. I mean, I think a lot would be fixed by going back to campaign finance reform. I mean, it would even get to this question that was asked earlier about why the Democratic Party isn't producing a kind of a new generation of leaders that actually make it to that level. And part of it is because you need so much money that if you're not coming out of this party establishment, it's very hard to get access to it, and that's an impediment, I think. We've always had personality-driven politics in the United States, but it had a different flavor to it when we had essentially centrist politics with distinctive personalities, perhaps, in the mix. You think about Kennedy and Nixon, or Reagan and others who, they were distinctive. Nixon aside, but I mean, why Kennedy beat Nixon, it was an image thing in a sense. It wasn't so much about policies a little bit, but it was an image thing. And Reagan also, even for Democrats, embodied a kind of attractive personality. He was optimistic, and all the rest of it. But it was a different kind of politics in a different time. And that's kind of what we're dealing with. I don't know that we're necessarily going to see even more aggressive Democratic Party. Maybe that's one of the answers. I don't really know. What I do know, and we haven't even really hardly talked about it, is what's happened to the Republican Party. the capture of the Republican Party, which used to be a very different thing. And the change, the shift in that, has maybe been the most fundamental factor of all in this. And it has multiple roots, I'm sure, but it's changed American politics utterly to have what was an opposition and is now a governing party with those kinds of characteristics and a different ideology.
Lucas, do you want to comment?
Just a quick point about, I referred to before the crisis of democracy, and which is not just a American thing, it's also a European thing. Well, part and parcel of the crisis of democracy relates to the quality of people going to politics in recent times. And the quality is steadily going down throughout the Western world. You may go, and this is going to be a very long discussion as to why this happens, but this is, I think, a fact of life. And that also explains partly not only delivery, poor delivery, but also growing disappointment, anger, and distancing of part of the electorate from the democratic process. They simply do not feel represented by people in power. And that's not just an American problem.
We only have 4 minutes, so I'm going to take, there are 3 questions, but please, 1 question and a quick question. Yes, the gentleman there. Yeah, it's there, yes.
Hello, my name is Iliadis. I'm a chemist from the University of Texas. Being from Texas, I understand the situation very well. The question, well, having stayed in Texas for 9 years, way back then, 2000. The question somebody asked a question, please let me answer it. The ticket that would smash Trump would be Kennedy and Gabbard. Ask the Democrats why they didn't do it, please. Now, my question, very short. Gramscian speak the era of the monsters, I don't remember exactly, but the interregnum being my problem. That makes me nervous. We have 2 months in which neither president is there. Now, this is the time I'm speaking chemically, the dangerous time in the lab and the time for black flags. My question is for Dr. Tsoukalis. How aware is Brussels, I'm not talking about Washington, about the need to rush diplomatically and present itself as trying to shut down conflicts in the neighborhood? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the interregnum can be dangerous because you will have literally a lame duck president and waiting for a few months for somebody else to come and take the baton. Which area would I expect, would I fear most? I would probably say the Middle East, because Mr. Netanyahu may feel even more unrestrained in this period of interregnum. He has already fired his defense minister, who was supposed to be the better link with Washington, D.C. and with the present administration. So if Mr. Netanyahu decides to take even more risks, given the fact that he has crossed so many red lines without any price to pay from the US, so if he tries to be even bolder in the next few months, we could be in trouble. Not to mention the Palestinians.
Okay, we have, yes, the gentleman there and then here, but please, very quick questions and only questions.
Thank you, it will be short. Remembering the 2 attempts on Trump's life during this year, which at the end were important for his campaign and his eventual win, and regarding his pragmatic nature that you noted, are we to suspect a rise of political violence in the future, even riots from dissatisfied voters, since Trump's campaigns were based on anger and, as you said, maybe impossible and radical change? Or should we not worry for the ignition of such events?
Ian?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that you should worry. And there've been polls of experts and others on this in the United States. People normally focused on international security issues, and when they were asked what they really worry about this year, they said political violence in the United States. The fact that it wasn't necessarily close or disputed probably helps in a sense. But you have still a lot of angry people, a lot of guns in the country. We'll see what will happen. It's been part of our political culture, unfortunately, for a very long time. I wish I had a solution to how to get rid of it, but it's there, and I think we ought to worry about it. There was also a poll about this recently, a very well distributed poll that talked about both asked Republicans and Democrats, how willing are you to contemplate violence in a political cause in the United States? And surprising numbers of people said that they were willing to contemplate it. They thought it was legitimate. A higher number on the Republican side, but it wasn't minimal on the Democratic side either.
And one last question here in the front, please.
I'm Alexia, I'm also an NMF alumni. So I wanted to ask regarding the ceasefire, the possible ceasefire in Ukraine, which would be the terms, what would it mean for the EU, NATO, the US, and also taking into consideration the situation in the Middle East? Thank you.
It's not an easy question.
Sorry.
It's profoundly to be hoped for, above all for Ukrainians who are paying an enormous price, obviously, for all of this. At a certain point, there's just exhaustion. I mean, it's existential for Russia, it's existential for Ukraine. Increasingly, it's not necessarily seen as existential in Washington, which is a bit of a new dynamic, maybe. But it matters. And, well, what could I imagine? I could imagine Ukraine not giving up on its objectives of recovering its territory, just as West Germany didn't, its full sovereignty, but being able to be secure within what it has and progress in its Euro-Atlantic integration, that's to say the EU as well as NATO, eventually, because under the current conditions that's not possible. So I think that if you can get to something that looks like that, you can at least stop it. End it is a different thing, but to stop it, to get a ceasefire, to move on to something else.
I would agree. People have been talking about versions of a ceasefire that looks like either the Korean solution or the German solution. All right? You recognize the dividing line, you do not recognize new borders, and you try to, if it is the German solution, you try to integrate the rest of Ukraine into the European organizations or even NATO. NATO more difficult, I think, and hope for the best. That is more or less the scenario for a ceasefire, I think, realistic.
Well, you asked for a small, is it very, okay. Okay. If we can have the microphone here and then we end. Okay.
So in light of what you said, Professor Tsoukalis, with the politicians in Europe not really showing much pizzazz or qualifying for their work, does that mean that the voters who voted the landslide victory for Trump make Trump a politician?
Well, I mean, Trump is a very interesting case because he appears as an anti-systemic guy who is part of the system. He's a billionaire himself, all right? But he has some kind of charisma, not the kind of charisma that appeals to me, but judging from the results, it is a charisma that appeals to many Americans, all right? And now, but the comment I made about the quality of the political class was not only about Europe, it was also about the United States. There is a problem. Now, Trump, in a sense, followed the example of somebody who created a revolution in politics. And this is Berlusconi. the rich guy who appears anti-systemic and tries to change the system. So Berlusconi was the first rich man who came out of political parties and took over Italy. All right? He's been followed, that example has been followed in other countries. Babiš did exactly the same in the Czech Republic, and not only. And Trump is another example. I mean, you would think that in the US, the possibility of such people doing this is more likely, given the role that money plays in politics. So you need lots of money, but this is not necessary because you can mobilize others. So Musk as the 48th president of the, or 49th president of the United States, why not? I mean, why not as a possibility, not as a wish? He wasn't born in the US, okay. Okay, okay, so we are saved. All right.
Well, I don't know, Ian, do you want to add anything?
No, I fully agree. Look, I mean, we do have a tradition, okay, so they weren't billionaires necessarily, but we have a tradition of certainly of elites, you know, taking on populist mantles and being extremely successful with it. I mean, FDR would be an example of this, maybe Kennedy's in another sense. They were slightly different, but they managed to mobilize the support, even though it was very clear that you know, they didn't have much in common with the person in the street. But still, they conveyed a sense of empathy. And he managed to do this without conveying a sense of empathy. It's talent.
Yes, talent. Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much, Luca Tsoukalis, Ian Lesser, and we don't forget Mike Vanatos. And I want to give special thanks to the Greek Fellows of the Marshall Memorial Fellowship Program. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. Thank you all.